name is Charlotte Hayon-Ko. I'm 50 years old, and I'm currently the Executive Vice President of Acquisitions and Co-Productions for Lionsgate in the Motion Picture Group. The crux of the job is to look for movies that are good for theatrical distribution for Lionsgate. So a lot of it is about going to film festivals and film markets and looking at not only completed movies, but reading a lot of scripts that are packaged with directors and actors and making the assessment financially and creatively of, is this a good movie for us to distribute? My father came to be a graduate student at Utah State University, which is in Logan, which is about an hour-ish north of Salt Lake City. And as he put it, when they were back in Korea taking the TOEFL and doing the applications, he goes, we don't know anything about any of these different American universities, so you go where you have a friend. And he goes, and I had a friend. He had gotten engaged to my mother before he left Korea in 1969, but it was a secret engagement because her family didn't approve. And she then follows him 3 years later after having finished her master's degree at Ewha. He had gone to Yonsei. And she had a wedding dress and veil and shoes made in secret because at least she had some money from her job as a teaching assistant or something. And so her friends meet her at the airport and one of them just hands her a suitcase and that's where the wedding gear is in that suitcase. So she gets on the plane. She goes to my dad. They get married 2 weeks after she arrives in the US on December 30th, 1972. My dad's master's thesis advisor walks her down the aisle. They get married in a Presbyterian church in the dead of winter, right? Logan, Utah, in like December 30th. I mean, this is just, there's snow everywhere. And the reception looks like it's a cake and Hawaiian punch. And it's just like the other Korean grad students and some members from the school community are there for their wedding. And then I'm born almost exactly a year later in Logan. But that's how we ended up in Utah. And then we moved to Chicago because my mother's brother lived there. And he wanted my mother to help him with his 3 kids. And my dad was accepted into a PhD program at University of Illinois at Chicago. So that's what made us move to Chicago in 1976. I don't think I had any idea until I was much older, maybe in my 20s, that there was even such a thing as being an executive inside a media company. Because my parents are very traditional Korean people. So their whole aspiration for me is you should really go to law school because they felt it was a genteel and respectable profession for a young woman. My interest, though, probably starting in junior high, high school, was I really loved acting. And I loved, when I got to college, like studying plays and seeing plays, and I loved the theater, and not the kind of traditional theater that I think is more mainstream, because, you know, in college everyone's doing like Guys and Dolls or whatever. I was actually interested in like the avant-garde kind of theater. Yeah, exactly. The kind of stuff that is really not approved, that had to do with pushing boundaries. I remember seeing this guy at my college, he did a production about the Marquis de Sade, and he was completely nude, and he had somehow flooded a small bathroom on campus by like backward doing the plumbing on the toilets. I mean, I would go seek out that kind of theater. So in college, I acted in a couple of avant-garde plays with this guy named Matthew Causey, who's now a professor of drama at Trinity College in Ireland. This is like the early 90s, and it's the first integration of live camera work video with actors on the stage. And the first play we did was Jean Genet's The Maids, which is very alternative. And then the second play was like Ionesco's 6 Characters in Search of a Story. So they were all like really kind of arty in retrospect, not super accessible to everyone type of interpretations of storytelling and characters, but I kind of loved the lack of predictability of that kind of thing. So I don't think it's a surprise when I got to college, not only did I do that kind of theater, but then I also intellectually got interested in people like Noam Chomsky, the linguist. I ended up also doing courses in like study of the short story, you know, all types of things that are basically related to storytelling and the art of it, but in a very avant-garde, alternative way. And I also had my first introduction to like independent cinema probably in my mid to late teens. And then I got to college, and my freshman year, the resident assistant, he was a total film buff. And so he took us to see like My Own Private Idaho, The Crying Game, and these were movies I was like, oh, and I was lucky, right? I was a freshman in 1991. So this is the cool age of like the Down and Dirty Pictures era, and I'm getting fed all this great American independent cinema, which is like dovetailing with the type of kind of bizarre theater that I'm interested in, weirdly, at the time. But I never thought about it as a profession. I think I was sensible to know I had student loan debt, you know? And it was this real negotiation with my parents. I'm also only child, so they have no other horses to bet on. And we made this bet when I was a senior. They said, if I got into law school at Stanford, which is where I was an undergrad, I would have to go. But if I didn't get in, and I did apply to 7 other schools, and I could manage to get a job, then I could take the job. And I knew I wasn't going to get in because it was so, even back then, it was so competitive. I was like, I'm not that kind of student. I'm fine, but I'm not that kind of student. So I didn't get in. And I got into other places, including the University of Chicago. But I got a job offer at a consulting firm in San Francisco. So I just took that job. And then that took me to London when I was 23. I go to London. I end up watching, shockingly, a bunch of London theater, of course. And there's a ton of independent movies in London. So you're watching things like Microcosmos, which is a documentary with absolutely no dialogue about the lives of bugs. And it's just a brilliant, brilliant stuff. But it also is life-changing because one of my clients is MTV Europe at that time. And MTV Europe in 1998, it's very rudimentary. Like, they are having trouble sometimes having a consistent signal. Like, the signal could go black for 30 seconds. So as a management consultant, we get hired. It's a little like Office Space. We go in, we interview all the senior executives, and then we decide the outcome of this project was 500 people getting laid off, right? Which is, when you're 24, you're callous and you're like, well, look, our job was, reported in the Financial Times. It made news. But in retrospect, you're like, wow, that was really brutal when you think about the true outcome. However, it was the first time I ever got to talk to real media executives. And it's the first time I start to understand, like, oh, there's this whole set of jobs where you're not the writer, the director, or the actor, but you're facilitating their work in a kind of pseudo-corporate structure that offers some level of job security, some level of, safety. At the same time, you get to be near all the creative people and really kind of be in it with them. I should be clear, too. I took the job because during the career fair my senior year in college, right, I'm desperately trying to figure out a way to, like, not have to commit to law school because I don't really know why I want to go, other than my parents feel that this is the right thing to do. And I'm starting to get an inkling at that age of, but there are lots of other things to do with my life other than be a lawyer or an academic, which are really the 2 major options my parents presented me with forever. So I take the consulting job mainly because it's good salary for someone who really doesn't know how to do anything, right? A political science degree. It means I'm literate, right? And then I have not a lot, but not an insignificant amount of student loan debt that I want to take care of and not ask my parents for help for. And best of all, the management consulting job is a non-committal kind of job because you're just going from company to company. It's Fortune 500. You get to travel. And so I end up talking to a friend of mine from school, from college, also Korean American, but a guy who had dropped out of medical school to go to USC film school. And he said to me, he goes, you should really think about this program. It's a 2-year MFA in motion picture producing. And I'm thinking, well, if he can drop out of med school, I think I've paid off my loans now. I've saved a bit of money. I can always go to law school later. At this point, I'm about 24, 25. And I start studying for the GREs. I take the GREs, I move back to San Francisco, and I get in to USC. And that's where the whole thing starts. And my parents are appalled. They're so appalled that when their parents, their other parents of other kids that I grew up with ask, like, what am I doing with myself while I'm in graduate school? They sort of just gloss over it, like, she's in graduate school, because they find it really embarrassing that after spending so much money on private high school, I went to the high school inside the University of Chicago, private university. So I felt a lot of obligation, I think, to both of them, to both my parents. But at the same time, I just didn't want to settle professionally. And so by the time I got to film school, I was also really enamored with people like Christine Vachon and James Schamus and David Lindy and all the people who were like creating the early indie film scene, mainly in New York at that time. So that was the path and how it started. But from there to where I am now, so from 25 to 50, I think it's been a very intuitive path. In other words, I didn't have like a huge plan. I ended up doing what I said I would do in my application to USC Film School, which is I got a job at Fox Searchlight, at an indie distributor that did specialty art movies. I got to be an executive there. This is where I got my training on how to do development work, writing script notes, talking to writers. But also this is where I start to get the foundation for what I do now, which is going to film festivals, understanding how acquisitions works, what happens at Cannes, Sundance, Toronto, Telluride, Venice, etc. And it's the 10,000 hours, it's happening there, right? Because you're reading, I don't know, maybe 300 scripts a year, you're probably watching 150 movies a year, you multiply that by 6, 7, 8 years, you suddenly have like a funny body of knowledge that is wholly impractical for pretty much anything else other than evaluating movies and evaluating filmmakers. Like that's all you can really do. And then I think a lot of my path was also a question of circumstance and practicality. So I worked briefly for what they call a debt financier, which is like a kind of film financing company that loans against incentive paper, rebate paper. And then the 2008 recession happened and I lost that job. But then miraculously, I got another job in less than a month at Marvel when it was just about to be purchased by Disney. And Marvel at the time was in production on Iron Man 2. So that was kind of an incredible stroke of luck because it was 250 people. I worked for the person who would become the CFO of the studios, and I learned an enormous amount about the financial, operational, and strategic priorities of a business driven by intellectual property, and how do you work on a $150 million movie with a $150 million budget, as opposed to the Searchlight movies that were a tenth of that size. So it was a really great education. And after that, I still hankered to go back to the creative, so I ended up as the first head of original programming for the service Hulu. That was a very interesting period of time. And it's very similar to Marvel. Marvel was about 250 people, and then when I got to Hulu, it was about 250 people. But the main difference was most of those 250 people were software engineers and MBAs. There were very few people who had come from entertainment or media. So there was definitely a lot of learning on both sides about how to communicate and how does a platform work. And it was a great primer in the dawn of streaming and how that would eventually shift everything about Hollywood. My parents this entire time have no idea what I really do for work. It's like a huge mystery to them. Somewhere towards the end of my tenure at Hulu, I end up on Bloomberg, like doing live TV, and I end up sending the YouTube clip to my mother, and she just can't believe it, right? Because it's me with my name and a chyron in the lower third. She's just like, oh my. And I think weirdly, that was more validating for her than almost anything else. And I just remained very career focused, I think, from my 30s and into my 40s. And the whole time, they are slowly getting around to the idea of what I do for a living, but it probably takes me until I'm at Hulu and show up on live TV for them to really sort of be like, oh, this actually might be okay. I think to the future Korean Americans who want to pursue this type of work, a lot of it has to come from your inner authenticity about why are you pursuing it very specifically, because I think there's a lot of external validation type reasons to do it, but none of those are going to really stand the test of time in terms of personal fulfillment. And it's important to find what is individually meaningful to you that doesn't have anything to do with what anybody else thinks. I remember very clearly when I was in London trying to figure out what am I going to do, because I'm not going to go to business school. What will I do after consulting, because I don't want to be a consultant forever. And I remember being up like in the middle of the night and just being like, for the first time it's actually quiet enough in my head to hear myself. To not hear my parents' voices, not hear my teachers, not hear my friends or my enemies or my bosses, but to really have this dialogue with myself of like, no, seriously, what do you want? And how clearly you, Charlotte, are you going to articulate what you want next? And I think it was those like moments kind of in the dark with my own thoughts that actually helped me find what I wanted to do. And that's the other thing that I think is also difficult to convey until you go through the experience is most of the best epiphanies in life happen at a moment of profound unhappiness and profound angst. But without that friction and without that type of mild suffering, it's not extreme, right? It's more existential. I found it personally difficult to kind of move to the next stage of what's my new mindset as I approach this next objective. And I found it very hard to balance personal and professional, quite honestly. Like, I think only now am I, in the last like 5 years, really prioritizing a lot of personal goals and my personal relationships in a way that's very different from the first 20 years I was a working professional. Because I was so scared that I would not make it. My name is Charlotte Hayoung Ko, and this is my Korean American story.